The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Sudanese Canadians fear for their loved ones in Khartoum and points beyond. The UN and the global community hope for peace. Tonight, the crisis in Sudan and how Canada can help. Then a conversation from earlier this week, hosted at Toronto Metropolitan University, about Canada's immigration narrative and whether we're as welcoming as we like to think. It's Friday, May 12th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. Fighting erupted in Sudan in mid-April as rival generals looked to assert their authority over the country. Frantic efforts to evacuate foreign nationals put the conflict on the international agenda. But as the weeks have passed without a resolution, tens of thousands are displaced and the death toll is mounting. With us now for more, in Montreal, Quebec, Khalid Mustafa Madani, Chair of the African Studies Program and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. And here in our studio, Nazreen El-Amin, Assistant Professor of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for being on the program. Before we start talking about what's happening on the ground right now in Sudan, I just wanted to go over some key historical dates, and then we'll start our conversation. 1956, Sudan gains independence from British Egyptian rule. Between 1955 and 1972, the First Sudanese Civil War broke out between North and South over demands for more regional autonomy by the Southern Sudan region. Between 1983 and 2005, the Second Sudanese Civil War breaks out between the Central Sudanese government and the Sudan People's Liberation Army. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir carries out a military coup, appoints himself president in 1993. Between 2003 and 2020, the war in Darfur between the Sudan Liberation Movement, the SLM, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, rebel groups against the government, which they say is oppressing Darfur's non-Arab population. The government responds with a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Darfur's non-Arabs. The UN estimates up to 300,000 people are killed in the fighting. 2011, South Sudan gains independence following years of war with the central government in Khartoum. 2019, the army ousts President al-Bashir after months of protest against his rule, leading us to today, in 2023. A power struggle within the military government sees fighting break out between the regular army and members of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. I also want to pull up a map of Sudan, located in Northeast Africa. It is the third largest country by landmass in Africa. It has a population of 46 million people, and the capital city is Khartoum. Nazreen, you were there. You were able to get out. Can you tell us about what happened?
Sure. I mean, we woke up on April 15th to the sound of gunfire in Khartoum and had to shelter in place, and found out soon after that the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces had started fighting. These two factions of the military coup regime essentially were vying for political and economic control of the country, and we were all caught in the middle of this. And so as days went by, we decided to evacuate from the neighborhood in Khartoum that we were in, that was particularly hard hit, to my father's village, an hour south of Khartoum. And then eventually we took a sort of long, difficult journey to Port Sudan, where we evacuated by ship. And I think, you know, the important point to make here is that the majority of people, including many in my own family, were not able to evacuate. For security reasons, but also for financial reasons. It's been incredibly expensive to leave the city, but also very difficult because none of the ceasefires that have been negotiated have actually held.
I just want to do a quick follow-up. I'm so glad that you're here. You were able to evacuate with your young child, 3. What was that like to leave your family while you were seeking refuge for your child?
I mean, it was incredibly difficult. My parents thankfully evacuated with us, and they're not U.S. citizens, so I would have never left without them. So that was a relief. But my aunts, uncles, cousins, many people are still there, and it's heartbreaking to see what's happening.
It must be very hard at night thinking about their safety.
Yeah.
Khalid, can you give us an idea of what's happening on the ground? We know that the Sudanese military and a paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, are currently fighting for control of the country. What are the main factors that led to this crisis?
Well, there are a number of factors, but Sudanese like to go back, if you will allow me, to 1989, when the emergence of the Islamic authoritarian regime of Omar Bashir took over power. And there were two policies that they implemented that have a great deal to do with the present conflict. One of them was their policy, very clear, to dominate the local economy, including the mineral economy of Sudan. The other one, which is directly related to the present conflict, is what we call, I suppose, in political science, coup-proofing. A policy in which the Bashir regime, the Islamic authoritarian regime, decided to weaken the National Standing Army by factionalizing the security apparatus. Emerging from that factionalization, initially in the early 2000s, was the Janjaweed that you probably heard of and many of your viewers would be familiar with. That Janjaweed militia was the creation of the Islamist regime of Omar Bashir, and he utilized it to put down insurgencies in Darfur. But also, very importantly, this militia was used historically to also put down dissent. The idea was to forestall any military coup against the Bashir regime, and at the same time also put down any dissent in civil society fighting for democracy. These are the two important factors that lead us up to what is extremely important, and that, of course, is the revolution of 2018 and 2019. But that was unprecedented. As your viewers and the whole world was watching, millions of Sudanese took not only to the streets of Khartoum, but throughout the country, overthrowing almost impossibly this very strong authoritarian regime of Omar Bashir in April of 2019. Following that, we see the trajectory of what unfortunately is happening now. And that is initially the cooperation and partnership between Burhan, the head of the National Army, and his deputy at the time, the head of the militia, the Rapid Support Forces, by the name of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who cooperated to undermine the efforts towards a transition to civilian democracy. In fact, very importantly, in October 2021, they upended that entire experiment and the path towards a democratic civilian government by waging a coup. They were at that time in partnership. Following that, Nasreen can add to that, and I know she knows it full well, Sudanese at the grassroots continued to mobilize on a daily basis against this military coup, forcing, in the context of initial support from the international community, forcing these two generals to get to the table and negotiate something called the Framework Agreement. There are a number of different stipulations of the agreement. Let me just focus on one that has led us to this tragic conflict.
Let me come back to that, but you did mention, these two groups are fighting, and caught in between that are the people of Sudan. Nasreen, what has life been like for people in Sudan since the fighting broke out last month?
I mean, I want to just make clear that, we're talking about a city, Khartoum, that is home to almost 7 million people. It's a mega city, very densely populated, and essentially the Rapid Support Forces have been using civilians as a human shield. They've been, occupying people's homes, embedding themselves in the neighborhood that we were in, and as a result, people are being bombed, essentially, just gunfire constantly, and hospitals have been destroyed or are no longer operating. Very few of them are. And so, it's very difficult to access food, water, electricity and water has been out in many parts of Khartoum. And also in Darfur, there are many towns and cities in Darfur that are also impacted by this violence. And it's, basically people are under siege.
I'm going to come back to you in just a second, because when we talk about what's happening in Sudan, there is a humanitarian crisis happening right now. The fact that people can't access water, they can't access food, just you have to kind of stay where you are for fear that you will be killed. Khalid, what is the concerns around the region and maybe this crisis causing the region to have instability?
Well, I think it's really a huge concern. Initially, no one could have predicted the kind of quick expansion of the conflict. But you have a country, as you showed in your map, that is neighbored by 7 different countries. It borders the Sahel region, which has historically, over the past a couple of decades, been very volatile. Crucially, it, of course, borders South Sudan, undergoing its own conflict, and of course, Ethiopia, that is also undergoing civil conflict. And the refugee flows are extremely important. And very, very importantly, of course, Sudan borders the very strategic Red Sea and Indian Ocean area. Once the conflict began to expand, the international community, whether it's the United States, Canada, a host of, and Saudi Arabia, of course, began to see not only the huge humanitarian crisis, but from their perspective, also the problem of spillover, not only in the Sahel, but the very strategic Red Sea area. And this, I would argue, is unfortunately, one of the main just as much as we're focusing on the humanitarian crisis, for those regional countries and also external actors, their focus increasingly is on the strategic issues associated with the potential of a spillover in a very volatile part of the world, and particularly a strategic part of the world, the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea area. And historically, many countries have vied to establish bases and strategic control in that part of the world. And so that's why there's great international concern with respect to the conflict in Sudan.
And Nisreen, it's also been reported the Russian mercenary group Wagner has been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles to aid their fight against the country's army. The RSF has denied this. But is this worsening tensions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to be clear here that while this is not an externally orchestrated war, it's definitely externally supported, right? You have, as you mentioned, the RSF getting arms and fuel. There are credible reports of that through Libya, through General Haftar, who's in turn supported by the UAE and Russia. And on the other side, we have the Sudanese armed forces that are being supported by Egypt. And, I think going back to this humanitarian crisis, we have a basically non-existent humanitarian response from the international community. I mean, it's been too little, too late. And the people who are actually providing life-saving support right now to civilians are resistance committees in different neighborhoods across Khartoum and in other parts of the country that were at the forefront of the popular resistance against not only al-Bashir, but this military coup regime that is currently essentially fighting each other, right? And these are really the people that from the very beginning have been asking for a full transition to democratic rule, and they've been sidelined in this protracted process of negotiations that has always been tipped in favor of the military. There hasn't really, they haven't been, as I said, these resistance committees, they've really been sidelined in this process, and even in the negotiations that happened over the weekend in Jeddah, there were no civilian actors. The civilian actors that were part of this protracted negotiation process that was then, derailed through this fighting have been hand-picked civilian elites that don't really represent the kind of popular demands of the people, which is that we transition to full democracy.
You mentioned the international response. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But Khalid, we've heard about these ceasefires being enacted, but they've not been upheld. As of right now, is there a clear way out of this crisis in Sudan?
I don't think there's a clear way out of the crisis at the moment, but in terms of the implementation of the ceasefire, the Jeddah talks, of course, if you read the statement, is really about trying to comply rhetorically to international humanitarian law. In other words, it's a kind of propaganda method or tool on the part of both generals. And in fact, they didn't go themselves; they sent a delegation. I think that I want to just emphasize what Nisreen said. The way out in the short term, of course, is putting pressure on these generals to allow humanitarian access. They're they're trying to get people out of Khartoum rather than actually help people in Khartoum. And you can see that clearly in the statements. They want basically people to leave in order to vie for military control of the city and the country. From my perspective, has to be understood in the sense that we have to, or the international community must put extra pressure. And then what Nasreen said is really crucial. If you don't mind me saying, the very concept of conflict resolution that is being applied is problematic in the sense that we know in other contexts in Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, that the role of civil society and the expansion of those kind of actors in negotiations is the only way to actually have a durable solution. And that is because these two generals have very limited constituency in Sudanese civil society. If they had greater popularity and greater constituency, there could be a potential of one of them stabilizing the country through authoritarian means. But we know from the history of Sudan and what Nasreen just mentioned, that that is actually not the possibility. The majority of Sudanese are completely opposed to both of them for a variety of reasons. And the only way we've seen in other post-conflict settings that these kind of wars stop is actually, believe it or not, expanding the role of civil society actors who have the legitimacy in civil society in order to actually, realize a durable peace. And I think I look to the African examples as we look forward in terms of the resolution of this conflict.
Nisreen, just to build on what Khalid was saying, do you see a scenario that could lead to a civilian democratic path for the country?
I mean, that's the only way out of this. I think what this moment should teach us is that we should have never put two criminals who are responsible for war crimes that span decades, not only in Darfur, but also the Nuba Mountains in South Sudan, at the negotiation table. They should have been tried. And in fact, what happened, especially in this post-coup, post the October 2021 coup, is that they've been repeatedly legitimized and framed as potential reformists when they've proven time and time again that they cannot be trusted. Anytime we got closer to kind of civilian, to tipping the power slightly more in favor of the civilians, they would either stage a massacre at a sit-in that was essentially demanding, regime change, or stage a coup. So there's always been proof, right, that they cannot be trusted, and yet we keep putting them at the negotiation table. We keep propping them up. In many ways, the Jeddah talks, to me, were essentially a green light for them to continue fighting.
A green light for
these two generals to keep fighting, because peace was never on the table. How can you have talks, right, that don't put peace on the table? What we really need right now is a coordinated international response that, as Khalid said, I think, to me, I put more faith into the African Union and the IGAD. There was a process that preceded this one in South Sudan that got derailed through the Jeddah talks, right? And so I think we really need an international coordinated response, not only to get a humanitarian response on the ground, but also to pressure these generals into stopping fighting. And that has to come through, we need to stop externally funding them, right? That needs to stop immediately. We need to freeze their assets. And eventually they need to be tried, right? That's what needs to happen. And for me, the only way forward is to really heed the call of the popular democratic forces on the ground, the resistance committees, the unions that have been the backbone of the revolution. They have a blueprint for the way forward. It is not up to us, I think, in the diaspora to even talk about what the next steps are. They know very well. We need to listen to them, and we need to, have them kind of guide any type of international engagement moving forward, because the international engagement that preceded this has, in my view, merely legitimized these war criminals and brought us closer to this moment.
Well, you mentioned the diaspora. Khalid, before we started taping, I was speaking to Nisreen about how I saw what was happening in Sudan unfold on Twitter. I didn't see it necessarily on the news until weeks later, but on Twitter, people saying this is what's happening, and finding out that the people who were able to leave, like you said, people who had passports, but people, if you don't have a passport or a visa, you're essentially stuck. What kind of impact has the crisis in Sudan had on the diaspora here in Canada?
Well, I think, Nasreen outlined it. I think you can imagine the kind of both psychological toll and also the deep concern for family members. All of us have immediate and extended family. Even as some of our relatives leave, the majority remain. And so there is a constant, not only, feeling of concern, but anxiety. And of course, what I want to say is because of that, what I have seen is a remarkable mobilization of Sudanese diaspora. I've been talking to 4 groups just yesterday. There are upwards now of 22 diasporic Sudanese Canadian organizations. All of them have put together this kind of alliance, an umbrella group, in order to try to help not only Sudanese in Canada to reconcile with their relatives, but even equally important, trying to lobby the Canadian governments and others to allow Sudanese to come and expedite the asylum process so they can come in. And of course, in addition to that, help with resettlement. This, of course, as you know full well, has been very successful in other humanitarian cases. And what I've seen, which I have not seen before, and I've been in the US and Canada for some time at different years, is the remarkable mobilization and unity. I am giving you talking points that the Sudanese Canadian community has actually, forwarded to me. It's absolutely remarkable. There's a branch of the Sudan Doctors Union. There are the Sudanese Canadian Associations, which is a grassroots organization throughout Canada that's mobilizing. And tomorrow, all of them are meeting in order to put all of this effort under one unified umbrella in order to make the case that, we need to expedite asylum cases. We need to expedite reconciliation of families, Sudanese Canadians who need their family here. Because as Nasreen said, even if you have the finances, and most don't, there is absolutely no way to actually get cash. And another aspect, of course, is to engage with the Canadian government in order to provide medical supplies. That is something that, for example, the Sudanese Doctors Union, that has a branch in Canada, is working tirelessly for. So there's a lot to be done, and the people taking the lead on this are 22 different organizations in Canada.
You mentioned Canada, Khaled. Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned Canada, and I'm curious, in your view, has the Canadian response been adequate?
I don't think it's been adequate, but I do think it's a learning process because I began these interviews and discussions with them at the very beginning. I think there's been a movement in terms of taking seriously Canadians who may not be diplomatic staff, essential staff, Sudanese who carry Canadian passports and permanent residents. I think there's been a shift to that. That allows me to think that there's a great deal of hope that the Canadian government will understand. I've spoken to a couple of them, that this is a grave humanitarian crisis, very similar to others that have happened recently. And
Nasreen,
the next step,
I would love to get Nasreen's input on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to appeal to the Canadian government to do more to evacuate people from Sudan who have family in Canada, but also others who might seek asylum. We're not talking about huge numbers here, and there have been special visa arrangements made for Ukrainians, for example, that could serve as a model for what's happening in Sudan. I also think it's important for the Canadians, like everybody else, to try to add pressure to cease fighting. If we don't stop this fighting, we can't get closer to where we need to get, which is full democracy. And I think the other thing that I want to mention is that there are also some, I mean, as Khaled mentioned, Sudan has gold, it has oil, mostly in South Sudan, but it has natural resources that people are interested in, including Canadian mining companies have played a role in Sudan in the past. The Port Red Sea region is a strategic area that people are interested in. So, in many ways, Sudan has been sort of viewed as a place to extract things from, right? And that's really undermined any form of democracy. And Canadians, I think, need to be aware of the fact that there's, for example, a PR firm that is based in Montreal that, for a short period of time, actually represented the Rapid Support Forces, right? And so there are, corporate and other kinds of interests that we also need to expose and shame, and that needs to stop.
Khaled, Nasreen, thank you so much for helping us understand what's happening in Sudan, and our thoughts are with the people of Sudan. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for covering what's happening in Sudan.
Thanks.
thank you.
Earlier this week, we were on the campus of Toronto Metropolitan University as part of the CERC, the Canadian Excellence Research Chair, Migration and Integration Conference. We discussed whether how we talk about welcoming newcomers actually matches how we act. Our guests were Debbie Douglas, head of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants; Goldie Hyder, president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada; and former mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi. Take a look. So I thought that maybe we could start talking about our own immigrant stories, because I think this is a whole panel of immigrants. My family came here as refugees, and I was around 10 years old. And I've been able to do many, many things in this country, including sitting up here in front of a group of people with distinguished guests, to have this opportunity to learn from all of them. I would never have had this opportunity in Uganda. But the thing, as much as I've gained from being in Canada, Canada saved my life, but it destroyed my family. And I will come back to that, because I think we hear the one narrative of the immigrant story where they come to Canada and everything is great, but it doesn't always work like that. So I wanted to get an idea of your immigrant stories. Goldie, maybe I'll start with you. What is your immigrant story?
Well, we came to Calgary in 1974 from India, and my brother and I and my parents. I think Dad said he had $28 in his pocket at the time. Not surprisingly, his foreign skills accreditation issues meant that he didn't continue pursuing journalism here. We started a family business called Calgary Home for about 25 years before my family and I moved to Ottawa. I think it's just a vintage immigrant story. The people that I work with in my business council, so many of our CEOs have those kinds of stories, including having been refugees who landed here, didn't speak a word of French or English, but went on to run Air Canada, for example, or now, CIBC CEOs, parents came, and these two brothers were the same. So the story is at all levels of Canadian life, and so it's just a small part of my story.
And Naheed, what about you?
I should start with a disclaimer in case it gets spicy later. So Goldie is, in fact, not just a Calgarian, but someone I've known my whole life. I think we met when I was 16 and you were, 40. So
I lost my vote.
So we're very comfortable. We're very comfortable with one another. I'm actually not an immigrant. I was born about 1.5 kilometers away from here at St. Mike's Hospital. My mother was pregnant when they immigrated to Canada. So I always say I was born in Canada, but made in Tanzania. And growing up, I always wondered why my parents and my sister had these wonderful, ornate certificates of Canadian citizenship, and all I had was a lousy birth certificate. But I will say, and we're gonna get into some less nice things, I think, going forward, but my immigrant story and Goldie's immigrant stories, maybe it's a Calgary thing, are exactly what you think they would be. Stories of struggle, of people coming, of not having their accreditations realized, of finding that this land was actually much tougher to live in many ways than the land they came from. But ultimately stories of success, and particularly stories of success for the next generation. And that's a very comforting thing that we tell ourselves as Canadians, that everything will sort itself out by the second generation and the kids are going to be fine. There are a lot of problems with that. But I will say that in my life, I've been very lucky to have that very typical but very Canadian story. I always say my story is extraordinary precisely because it's so ordinary. Not everyone gets to be the mayor, as a first generation Canadian. But that story of service and sacrifice, but ultimately success, is a story that has been common in Canada. And I think it's important, though, for us to really focus on the people for whom it has not been the story, and figure out what it is that we've done, what it is we've designed, and what it is we've allowed to happen by neglect, to not make sure that story is for everyone. And I'll have a lot to say about that, I think.
That you don't have to be extraordinary to, be able to be part of the society.
Exactly.
Right. Debbie?
Similarly, I came to Canada just before I turned 11 from Grenada. I came to join my mom and stepdad. My mom had left a couple of years before to join my stepdad in the U.S. After a couple of years and a brother, they decided that Canada was probably a better bet. My father wanted to come to do graduate studies. I assumed that the tuition here was cheaper than in the U.S. But it was also because I think my stepfather had met a number of years prior, just casually on the beach in Grenada, this white Canadian tourist, and they set up a friendship that lasted over many years. And when my parents decided that New York wasn't going to cut it for them, he contacted this guy who happened to own a business, who sent him a job letter, and so he came in, and a couple of years later, he was able to go into York University, and my parents were able to get their permanent resident status. My mom, who was a teacher in Grenada, could not teach when she came, and so ended up working as a practical nurse in a nursing home. Fast forward, I remember as I was thinking about this, a memory came back to me. My first year of my first week in school here, I was supposed to go into grade 5, and as we were registering, I could hear my stepdad with a raised voice, and I couldn't quite tell what it was that they were talking about, but I knew it was about me. And I watched him approach me as I was sitting there wondering, just looking around. Everything was very new, very lots of whiteness around me in this elementary school. We were in North York, Jane and Finch. So imagine Jane and Finch in the early 1970s, not as it looks now, for those of you who know Jane and Finch. And my dad said, you need to write a test. Long story short, I wrote the test, got through. I was placed in grade 5. A year later, we found out I actually tested a couple of grades ahead, but of course, they didn't put me forward. Yeah, at the end of that week, and I was going through that week, right, and finding myself, and this is how identity gets formed. I come from a majority Black and Indo-Caribbean country, Grenada, with a few, we saw white tourists, but not in any intimate way. So I had a lot of touching of my hair, and I was interested in blonde hair that I thought probably felt like straw, and I was very surprised that it was actually soft. But by the end of the first week on the playground, I got called the N-word, and it shook me to my core. And I looked around to see if anybody had heard, and nobody said anything. And then I looked around to see what other kids looked like me, because there weren't any in my class. And I saw one girl with a group of friends across, and then I saw another boy playing tag with a group of young boys. And as it turned out, there were only 3 of us in a school of 500. There were 3 Black kids. And I don't recall any other kids of color. And so that went on for two years that I was in that elementary school. One of the other lessons I learned is that the next week when I went to school, I was called to the principal office, and there was Bonnie Beckler, whose name I remember, and Bonnie, in case you're listening, who had called me the N-word, and her mom was in the office, and her mother had brought her to apologize. So clearly a teacher or somebody had seen, and they had talked about it. Anyways, fast forward, my father gets his degree, in economics, can't find work anywhere. Ends up doing some financial planning, but mostly drove cabs to take care of our family, and died at a very young age. Now, if you ask my mother what her experience of migration has been, she will say it was very positive, that Canada has been very good to us. She has successful children. Both my brothers went to school in the US. They're highly successful. One is a lawyer, one is in the medical field, and she's had a wonderful life. But then once I started working, and I probably told the same story as you did, right? You came to Canada, my parents worked hard, we went to school, we now live a middle-class life. It's a great migration story. But 3 decades ago, when I started working in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, starting work with abused immigrant women, the reality really hit me in terms of what women were going through. At the same time, I was becoming aware of what was happening with domestic workers. And so I started paying attention to that, right? This whole story that you just heard from the three of us isn't necessarily the story.
Nahed, we had a preliminary conversation about this, and you said something that kind of stuck with me. You said that the Canadian immigration system is the greatest bait and switch system. What did you mean by that?
So I feel a bit spicy, so
We like spicy.
well, Salad King's just across
like
the way, so I
honesty.
got to get myself ready. But let me make a couple of propositions. Proposition number one is when we had President Trump in the U.S. and he was talking about reforming the immigration system in the U.S. and we as Canadians were like, ooh, that sounds terrifying and scary. He was actually talking about building a Canadian system in the U.S. He was actually saying rather than focus on family reunification, we should focus on people with the best chances of succeeding economically. And so we have a system where if you want to come to Canada, well, there's a series of points you can win. Do you speak English or French fluently? Most important, are you educated in a profession that is in short supply in Canada? So you tick off all these boxes, and in a very, very antiquated paper-based system, years later, you will hear from the Canadian authorities saying, congratulations, you can come to Canada. And probably nobody tells you that, oh, by the way, that profession that you work so hard to be trained in, yet we're not actually going to let you work in that profession. We're actually not going to accredit you in that profession. But by the way, we do need people in long-term care. We do need people to work in retail and in warehouses and as drivers. The reason I call this a bait and switch system is this is not accidental. This is easy to fix. So I'm also a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary. My office used to be on the same floor as the Faculty of Nursing. And the Faculty of Nursing at Mount Royal University, with our colleagues at the University of Calgary up the road, had created something called a Bridge to Canadian Nursing program. It was very successful. And it basically took foreign-trained nurses from non-white countries, because the nurses from white countries had an easier way of it. I think you'd agree with that, Debbie. But helped them get their Canadian accreditation, and it took about a year. There is a program that was just announced within the last month at Mount Royal University, at the place where I am on a very long leave, 12 years and counting, which was a new Bridge to Canadian Nursing program that can get people their nursing credentials in as little as a month. The Alberta engineers, the professional engineers and geoscientists of Alberta, actually accredit more foreign-trained engineers than they accredit Canadian graduated engineers every year. You can do it. We can figure out a way to train medical professionals and get them accredited very quickly, because look, a Philippine medical graduate probably can be a family doc in Canada without any further training. Yeah. But we can do a little bit to make sure. But right now, we charge them thousands and thousands of dollars to test. We force them into a system where it's impossible to get a residency. Why do we do that when there's a shortage of doctors? Well, we do it because we need LPNs. We need people at the front lines of the medical healthcare system that we don't have to pay as much. And so the argument that I'm making, the proposition I'll put forward, and I'm happy to be challenged on it, is that this is not accidental. This is by design. Whether through malice or neglect, we've designed a system, an economy, that only works when we have newcomers willing to take these jobs. So when we talk about our labor shortage that we're facing at this late stage, I hope it's a late stage of the pandemic, we almost never say that the reason we have a labor shortage is because we accepted very few immigrants for 18 months and it knocked our entire economy out of whack. We don't admit that. But I would argue that if we have created and designed a system that is so inherently unfair, we should have the political will, thank you, Andrew, from what people are saying, how they feel about immigration, we should have the political will to be able to design a system that's better, to design a system that's more just. I just don't know if we do.
I want to go to Goldie. At the beginning of Nahed's answer, you were nodding and you stopped nodding.
Yep.
I want to come to you because I think you have a different perspective. You've said that you want to demystify the feeling that immigrants are just for labor. I wanted to pose Nahed's comments to you.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, let me just say how proud I am to be Canadian. When you see those myths and where they rank and where the immigration levels have been over the last 50 plus years, like this is not possible in many, many parts of the world. Having said that, we should be cautious and not take it for granted. And I think it starts with, you use that phrase, I call it duping people. We dupe people when they come here. And what we've got to do is link all of these stories together. An immigration story is not a uniform story. It is about social policy. It is about economic policy. You know, it's about humanitarian policy. It's not either or, it's and. All of these things. And we shouldn't pigeonhole these categories either. It's not like refugees don't come here to work, that somehow they're just a cost to the society. And there's that humanitarian policy is an expense as opposed to, you know, a possibility of again, utilizing that talent and that skill set. When I speak with the members of the Business Council, which, you know, are a couple of million, who have a couple of million employees, or 50% of the Toronto Stock Exchange, outside of cyber, the number one issue I hear from everyone is talent and labor shortage. And this is despite record levels of immigration that are now coming in. I didn't believe that in my lifetime I would see 500,000 a year number. It's an astronomical jump from where we were in 1984, 1988, when Mr. Mulroney's government raised it to 250, and we had stalled there for the longest time. I actually think we should stop talking about the number because we've gotten to where we need to get to. What we need to do now is make sure that we utilize those numbers to do the things that we need them to do. You know, we're going to get soon to a level where we're going to have 2 people working for one retiree. That number used to be 7 to 1 just 50 years ago, I think, if I remember correctly. We can't sustain that. We can't sustain living in an economy like ours in a country the size of ours. And so the first thing we need to do is make sure that we utilize everyone who's here. It's not about bringing more people just because we need them. The first job is to make sure that people who are here, including underemployed immigrants, underemployed women, Indigenous groups that are underemployed, people with disabilities that are underemployed. Anyone who wants to work in Canada, we should facilitate their opportunity to seek and receive employment. If we did that, the data shows we'll still be short. And so we'll still need more and more people to come. And we've got to address the homegrown issue of foreign skills accreditation, which is not just a government issue. Frankly, it's a professional bodies issue. And it's really in a provincial domain where that needs to be addressed. Premier Moe, for example, just recently went to Philippines and brought 500 nurses because he said, I'm bringing them and I need them because my system needs them. So we're going to have to systematically break down some of these barriers while maintaining support for immigration. Immigration is our secret sauce. It is a defining characteristic of what it means to be Canadian. This is a unique place. It's a unique experiment that doesn't work in many other countries. But to maintain that support, you can't dupe people on the way in. You must give them the chance to have the opportunity to participate fully in their economic prosperity. We have to create the conditions for that to happen. And I can tell you that in the business community, what we've been saying to the Department of Immigration and the Minister and others is, let us help you. Let this be a partnership. Let's go together and promote Team Canada when we travel. Too often as Canadians, we go abroad and we want to promote Ontario and Alberta and Newfoundland. You know, abroad, nobody knows that. You just know Canada. They might know Toronto, but they don't know much more beyond that. And so let's promote Canada. Let's do it in partnership where we can expedite approvals of people wanting to come in the country. You go for this booth, and then the next booth says, oh, these are the employers that are ready to hire you. On the spot, why don't we create a Nexus program for employment? Why don't we have a Nexus program for universities and colleges to recruit students? Why must our governments do everything? Let's partner with them and ease that and give us the responsibility to help them get employed, to help them get housed. You know, we're in for doing that. So we have to think differently about how we got here, because how we got here is not the way we're going to get to where we need to get to.
Debbie, Goldie said that immigration is the secret sauce for Canada. You've said that, quote, we've seen so many bodies of African babies swept up by the ocean. Where's the outrage? Is the Canadian public welcoming of immigrants?
When I made that comment, the context was around our humanitarian program and who it is that Canada welcomes. So I strongly disagree that as Canadians, we welcome all equally. We saw the difference in the response to the little Syrian baby that washed up on the shores, and there was an outpouring of support from Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Our political parties were stepping all over each other to see who can take in more. It happened to have been an election period, and so the Conservatives were saying 10,000. The Liberals decided that they're going to take in 40,000. And we saw Canadians just clamoring and renting homes and wanting to privately sponsor. And at the same time, we were seeing the bodies of Black African babies washing up on the shores of the Mediterranean. And I'm still waiting for the outcry. We watched it in the 1980s with Somalia, right? When we watched the Canadian military and the devastation of that country. And we had Somalis here who, for 10 years, were in limbo, not being granted permanent status. And we go back, right? I agree with Nahed that our immigration programs are intentional. 1911, when Canada talks about its relationship to Black peoples, we often hear about the Underground Railroad. We never hear about the enslavement of my people in Canada. We never hear that in 1911, remember 300 years after the first Black person who, as a free person, landed here in Canada, 300 years later, there is an order in council to stop Black migration from the US to Canada. That's one of the narratives of Canadian immigration. In the 1950s, a domestic workers program for Caribbean women was set up, 3,000 women, because Canadian homes needed people to clean. And after a year, they were able to were granted permanent resident status, the beginning of two-step immigration for Black people. We saw 10 years later, in the 1960s, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program put in place a relationship between the Canadian government and the Jamaican government that was later broadened to other Caribbean islands and later then to Mexico. Again, two-step immigration. But even for the seasonal agricultural workers, primarily Black men, no access to permanent residency. They come in for 10 months of the year, they harvest our food, they plant our food, they package our food, and then they're sent home. They pay into CPP, they pay income tax, they pay EI. Very, very few have access because as soon as they get sick, as soon as there's an accident, they're shipped back to the Caribbean. That too is a Canadian immigration narrative. Canada's immigration system is racialized, it is gendered, and it is classed. Last year in 2022, Jamaican workers in the Seasonal Agricultural Program wrote a letter to the government of Jamaica asking them to intervene to stop the exploitation that they were experiencing it. And they talked about the experience of being in the Seasonal Workers Program as one of indentured servitude and systematic slavery.
In Canada?
In Canada, at this time. This was last year. The conditions on our farms are deplorable. But yet these are the employers that the Canadian government looks to help guide and to decide how these programs work. Right? So I don't buy that everyone is welcome into Canada. Because we see temporary foreign workers, there's an explosion of temporary foreign workers. Goldie will tell you in Canada, international students, high skill levels, immigrants temporary workers from Europe, temporary workers from Asia in many cases, have a pathway here. The folks who we need, who are building our houses, who are packing our meats, no pathways to permanent residency. And I know there's a small pilot that the government just announced yesterday that they were extending, but who is left out of that it's called the Agri-Food pilot, who is left out? Seasonal agricultural workers who are primarily Black men are not able to access that program.
In 2018, a study shows that the City of Toronto estimated that about 40% of people who were using shelters identified as refugees or asylum claimants. And, you know, a growing number of newcomers to Canada are ending up in shelters or finding themselves unhoused.
Yeah.
And we also know that a lot of Canadians are struggling to pay rent. They're having a really difficult time just getting on the housing ladder. So can Canadian governments create enough affordable housing for immigrants and non-immigrants while also keeping in mind that people here already are struggling to, you know, have houses and homes to live in?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, and it's through the use of public policy. Housing is largely a density and a zoning issue and a labor issue. We need people to build those houses that everybody is asking for. So I think if we can deregulate some of these things and create, and why ask me? Why not ask the former mayor who's involved in this zoning? And there's a lot of NIMBYism that goes on here as well. People say, yes, I support affordable housing, just not where I live. And so we have to have those conversations. But Nahid, you would have direct experience as mayor.
Yeah, so I'm very hesitant of this. This is a relatively recent innovation in our discourse to really tie immigration to the housing crisis. Because the housing crisis, especially in this part of the country, is very much on people's mind. And I'm very hesitant to draw that tie together. They are two quite separate issues. And indeed, we need to work on housing and know the answers are not near as simple as Goldie highlights, but I'll get to that in a second.
Leadership, neat.
But I'm very hesitant to tie those two things together.
Why are you hesitant?
The reason I'm hesitant is because the thing we didn't hear from Andrew is how deep those beliefs are.
Yeah.
So, for example, in Alberta right now, we're going through two horrible crises. Of course, we're having a terrible situation with wildfires, and we're also going through a particularly horrifyingly frightening provincial election. And the only thing that is not frightening about the political discourse in Alberta right now, and indeed in all of Canada right now, is we haven't seen anti-immigrant rhetoric. But we've seen everything else in that recipe book. And, you know, certainly the People's Party of Canada, who I'm still mad took my campaign color of purple, hit about 9% in the last election. They're about 3.5%, 4% in the polls right now. That doesn't sound like much when we compare it to, for example, the European situation. But if a Danielle Smith or a Scott Moe or a Pierre Poilievre or, I don't know, a Francois Legault suddenly see that the way to get above where they've topped out in their popularity at 30-odd% with pretty hard right policies is to take an anti-immigrant narrative, and that may get them from 30% to 40%, which is what they need. I'm not sure that the depth of the attitudes that Andrew is talking about will hold.
Yeah.
Because if it's a marginal difference of people, and if we rile people up by saying if we allow more immigrants in, that will exacerbate our housing crisis, then that is a very easy path that I see. And we've seen in a very short period of time, really the last 5 or 6 years, what are we, 2023? Let's call it the last 7 years, that things that were unthinkable to be in public policy in 2014 or 2015 are now part of the mainstream rhetoric, even of my premier in Alberta. And so, yes, there's a housing crisis. No, it's not about NIMBYism. No, it's not about the cities blocking the creation of new housing. It's not about that at all. It really is about the lack of ability to build affordable housing, the fact that the development industry really has no incentives from a policy perspective to build housing that people can afford. And there's an economic reason for that very quickly. There's 3 costs of housing, okay? There's the cost of land, there's the cost of construction, and then there's the cost of regulation. Basically, those 3 things are what it takes to build a home. But here's the thing, the cost of land is the same, whether you're building luxury condos or affordable housing. Shockingly, the cost of construction is the same. The granite countertops are a very small part of the overall construction cost. So if I'm a builder, what's my incentive to build housing that people can afford? So that's where policy comes in, the cost of regulation. There's a bunch of garbage data out there that says regulatory costs are adding hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cost of a home. I've never seen any evidence that that's actually true. Nor have I seen any evidence that there are gatekeepers in municipal government preventing housing from being built, because we want housing to be built. Yes, there's NIMBYs and they show up at council with their signs. They never win. They rarely win. They sometimes win, okay, but when they're really, really rich. But usually council just overrules them, at least in Calgary.
And I would
But there's a big policy issue here around what can we do to encourage the private sector, because the private sector's got to be the solution here, to actually build homes that people can afford. And it's not just about density, it's something much more fundamental about the economics. Sorry, Debbie.
No problem. Where I disagree with you is that I don't think it's only the private sector. I think we ended up in this housing crisis because the federal and provincial government absented themselves from building,
100%.
from building housing
100%.
beginning in the mid-1990s. We had co-ops being built, and my concern when we talk about affordable housing, in Toronto, affordability is defined as 80% of market. In $2,500 for one bedroom in Toronto, who can afford 80% of that? If one lives in poverty, right? So we need subsidized housing built. We need the federal government to get back into building housing. We need the provincial governments to get back into building housing. I am not as convinced as many people that private-public partnerships work very well. I think it benefits the private sector more so than anybody else. And we're continuing to give developers free rein. We have a provincial government that even the conditions, even the little conditions that municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area, in Ontario for that matter, are able to put on developers so that they're building community assets as part of building housing has been taken away by our provincial government, which then squeezes our municipalities even more so, who are wanting a need like Toronto to build housing. So I agree, it has nothing to do with immigration. I think it becomes a distraction and a dog whistle for those who are not wanting immigrants to come into Canada.
And that's all for this Friday, May 12th, 2023. Monday, we'll consider Ontario's recent moves to attract more police recruits by waiving tuition and removing the requirement to have a post-secondary education. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.